Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo and, yes, might just be a little bit radical. What if going carbon neutral could add hundreds of thousands or even millions to your bottom line? Today, I'm speaking to Bruce Taylor, founder and president of Enviro Stewards. Based in Ontario, Canada, Enviro Stewards are an engineering consultancy that help their clients sustain the environment, benefit society, and increase profits. They are spearheading Unilever's decarbonisation program in North America and have worked with a host of other businesses around the world. They've been named by B Lab as one of the best companies for the world and have been recognised by the UN for their impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. Bruce is also passionately committed to international development, working on a range of projects from South Sudan to El Salvador. There's some great stories ahead of us here. Bruce, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rob.
So Bruce, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
I would suggest maybe teenager level, feeling a little bit like an outsider. Once I found a few good friends, and I still have those friends now, 40 years later, I'm fine. But understanding that feeling helps me be more empathetic to other people and more interested in helping out kind of thing would be the first part of that leg, I guess. The other thing is, so about my mid-20s, I have what I call a pre-life crisis. Why are we on the planet? What's it about? These kinds of things. And so I spent a good 2 years kind of researching that kind of thing and then kind of a faith position myself. But then I had a quandary. I've just finished engineering. Am I going to quit engineering and go into ministry or something like that? But I felt, no, just keep doing what you're doing for a different reason. So that also shapes what I do and how I do it and the career path I've had since then.
Oh, I love that. So you call it a pre-life crisis. I think a lot of our listeners will recognize that. Mid-20s, you've started on some career path, but then sort of suddenly having a moment of, ooh, is this the right thing? I like your approach actually of I will keep doing what I'm doing, but for a different reason. I think a lot of people are looking for that. How can I use my accountancy skills or my marketing skills or my customer service skills, but for something that would benefit society more? I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. What was the first step you took once you'd kind of come to that conclusion?
So I would take leaves of absence from my employer and go do volunteer work. I was helping at like a rehab facility, like a farm community where people went to get off of drugs and alcohol and stuff like that. And worked out fine, but it was very challenging because you have to find somebody else to do all your projects while you're gone and you got to start from scratch when you get back. So then I tried half and half. So I worked half time at an engineering company, half time at that. That worked out really good actually. And so that's kind of, hey, that model's good. So eventually it became a challenge for a conventional employer just because of their metrics and whatnot. So I had to start my own company back in 2000, Enviro Stewards, with just myself. And we're about 20 people now, 18 people. And so when I set it up where I would do volunteer work. About 10% was local charity, 10% was international the whole time. And I encouraged my staff and give them paid volunteer time off, stuff like that. And so where can you do both is a really missing niche. Because a lot of technical people, they want to have an impact, right? And they're told just leave that part of you at the door when you come in. Whereas we're able to incorporate both. And in a practical sense, we have 10 times lower turnover than a normal consultancy, which allows us to train up our people much further, which is even more valuable for our customers. It all has kind of a virtual cycle that it all helps each other also.
I didn't realize it was actually sort of baked into the business model, this commitment to international development. I love how you sort of very diplomatically said that your half and half kind of model became challenging for a conventional employer. We're talking now over 20 years that you've been running this company. So I get a sense that our attitude towards being more hybrid and also giving more of our time and employers recognizing that their employees need time to do other projects, that's becoming far more acceptable. Have you noticed that over that time?
Exactly, yeah. When I started out, there wasn't even really terminology for it. And so under the banner of sustainability, it's economic, environmental, and social. And so say this development work that we do in South Sudan, Uganda, whatnot, actually fits under that, right? And so you can more easily get it into a common framework that way. But when we started out, it was just because we wanted to do both. And it's still a challenge, even in the B Corp framework, to accommodate that framework in their accounting system kind of thing, just because it's a little bit unusual. Basically, our paid work is in North America for the most part, where we work with manufacturers to help them save water, energy, product, that kind of stuff. And then we use a portion of that profit to do the development work in East Africa kind of thing. And so we don't get any revenue from that type of work. Any revenue from that stays in that country. And so that makes it a challenge under some frameworks to measure that impact.
That's an interesting challenge, isn't it? And a good one for B-Lab to take note of. I think there'll be lots of people listening to this episode who have been tasked with measuring your impact. And it's always a very tough thing. I think it's a good segue to move into your work now with Enviro Stewards. And you explained kind of what you do there. I said in my intro that you're spearheading Unilever's decarbonisation strategy. Now, that sounds, for anyone interested in sustainability and impact, like a dream gig, right? You've got, one of the largest companies in the world, huge impact, but I hear that and also feel absolutely terrified on your behalf at the scale of what you must need to achieve. And you're only doing North America as well, I understand. So how have you approached that problem? What's it like working on that? And what's the kind of the status at this point?
We found it very refreshing. Unilever is one of the only companies we work with where everybody in the company, from the top to the sanitation, are committed to this. You know what I mean? Usually it's, a champion who's very committed somewhere or other, but bringing everybody else on board is a challenge. So say we started at their mayonnaise plant in Toronto here, and we say, okay, we want to change the way you're making mayonnaise.
Wow. No one's set in their ways, being like, no, hands off my machines, Bruce,
Yeah, we've been doing it for 100 years this way, right? So say the nutrition for Unilever, they want to get to net zero by 2027, right? Which is soon.
Very soon, yeah.
So for the Toronto facility, we said, okay, if you want to get there in 2027, you do this in 2025, you do this in 2026, and you do this in 2027, right? And you get there. And you also get there by, essentially using about half as much energy to run this factory, and then frying the rest, and then replacing that amount of electricity somewhere else. And so they loved it so much that here's a credible, actual plan to get there. And so because of that, then each of their other North American plants started calling us up, right? And so at this point, we've done the rest of their nutrition ones, so the Knorr soups and some mayonnaise in Chicago and stuff like that. And now there are other ones, so the Dove brand, the deodorants, because they each have, in their case, it's 2030, I think, but they each have these commitments. And the reports they're getting from others are, okay, how do you start with the end? How do you source your energy differently? How do you spend millions of dollars every year, right? Versus how do we rethink the whole process and the building, and why are we buying heat to heat this building when we've got heat coming from the process anyway, right? How do we reuse, So these deep strategic things to actually use less in the first place is much more lucrative than anything you can do to generate energy some other way. And when you get to the point of electrifying, if you do need an electric boiler, it's now half as big. So now you need half the electricity supply, which you don't have now, because that amount of supply to the factory, getting more there, right? And so it all helps. And so most people don't start there. I don't know why not, but basically deep conservation first is the best way to go, because that's what generates the savings to pay for the rest of the journey and make the rest of the journey much easier.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you always start with, rather than how do we source the energy required for this process from a renewable source, how do we massively reduce the amount of energy full stop that's required for this process? Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. In the first place.
Amazing. And so you're doing things you were talking about there. So are you actually in a mayonnaise factory able to take some of the excess heat from producing mayonnaise and, I don't know, what does it do? Heat water to heat the building?
Exactly. Well, and to heat mayonnaise, right? First start in the same process, right? You got the right quantities, you got the right timing, use it locally to start with. But then beyond that, there's no sense buying heat to heat this building when we got heat that we're paying to get rid of right now from a refrigeration system.
Right. Yeah.
Instead of paying to get rid of that heat, let's reuse that heat again. No sense buying a heat pump when you're already running one, right? Your refrigeration is a heat pump, right? It's just spitting the heat in the wrong spot. So making the business case for each of those, the other key ingredient there is to measure it. So most people will walk through a factory and give them some ideas, but they don't get implemented. Versus coming in measuring it. Okay, this thing here is using this much energy, this quantity, this much water, whatnot. This is how much you'd actually save if you changed it. And if you do change it, you've already got the baseline measurement. Let's put the meter back on and leave the meter. And you can quantify the savings and you can take credit for that. You can get a text message when you start to lose the savings because somebody's thrown a valve or something like that. And so how do you tie that whole together with this permanent metering is another aspect of that.
And I imagine once you're proving it, putting it there in black and white for everyone's much happier to run with it forever, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Like Maple Leaf is another good example. So Maple Leaf is the largest protein company in Canada. They put a tender out for their 12 largest factories and they met with us. And I said, well, here's why. You asked for energy and water conservation. We're pretty good at it. We're probably going to save you a third of the water, which will create a wastewater problem because the concentration of everything will go up by 1/3. It's not in the RFP, but we've also included modifying your process to lose less food as you're processing it so that there's less in the water so that after you save the water, the concentrations don't go up. We'll take it out if you want. No, leave it in. So we did the first 12. We found an average of $750,000 per factory per year of savings.
Wow.
Then they sole sourced us for 22 more factories. So we've done every factory they have in North America. And so we've assessed, quick win, strategic things for each of the factories, which they've implemented. They've only implemented half, about 700 things we've recommended between those factories of the 1,300 things we found. But even that has got them to carbon neutral and saved them $17 million so far.
So that giant company, largest protein manufacturer in Canada, is now carbon neutral. How far ahead of where most similar companies or governments are targeting, right?
Exactly. So they put a Super Bowl commercial in 2019. It got overshadowed by the COVID epidemic probably, but they're the world's first large food company to get there. And you see everybody, every week, hey, 2030, 2040, 2050. Well, this was 2019 and it's not costing them money every year. They're saving money every year. That's probably what interested Unilever in giving us a shot at their plant there. And so we're working with others also. Jameson Vitamins is the largest vitamin company, and we've assessed each of their facilities also. What's missing is these plans. So here's what you need to do when, how much it would cost, how much it would save. Here's how much you need to invest each year to hit your goal, right? And to track that whole journey is kind of the missing piece, I think, is how do you come up with a strategic, credible plan in the first place? And that plan, in our world, people buy an energy audit. Well, what is an energy audit, right? So we literally lose every school board bid, every single one. Because those reports are actually already written right now. They don't have that school's name on it yet. And it's much easier to sell that than to go into the school, find the unique things that are available at that school to save that energy. But that's what you need to do to actually get to that savings kind of thing. If it's a tender for an energy audit, we'll lose every time for a public institution, right? But if you're actually buying energy conservation, then we're going to win every time because the stuff we find is faster payback, larger savings. If you actually want to get there kind of thing. That's, I guess, the world we're living in is, people aren't used to buying what we sell, right? So if you actually want to get there, then what we sell is what you need. If you just want to do a checky box that you've done an energy audit, then you want to hire somebody else.
That's really fascinating. And also, I feel you being in the business of selling community building solutions, very much also in a similar thing where, we're not always the thing that people need. But then if you do want a proper community built, we're the one.
Oh, actually, I have a good example of that also. There's a small winery here called Southbrook Winery. So they're already LEED Gold certified. They're organic, biodynamic, kind of top of their game. And they had a conventional energy audit done by the utility company. And they said, okay, you're doing great. Your next 5% savings is a 20-year payback. So the winery purchased solar panels because that was 7-year payback for them. After that, they had us come in and we said, actually, your payback is 40% savings with a 4-month payback. We implemented it. They saved 40% electricity, 40% of their gas. They canceled 1/3 of their solar panels because they didn't need them anymore. That saved 2 rows of vineyard from getting covered with solar panels.
They can produce more wine.
That brought the payback to 2 months because they can sell the wine, right? And so again, we'd say, don't use solar to waste your energy more efficiently, right? And so the way we did that was getting right in the weeds. We went in their cellar, the wine cellar. We said, you got this big honking ventilation system. What's that for? Well, the wine's got to be 17 degrees plus or minus half a degree. Okay. Does the wine have to be that or the air? The wine. So I took a wine jug with water in it, put a temperature probe in it, put another one in the air beside it in the cellar. Turned the system down 70%. The thermocouple in the water never moved.
Wow.
We just left it 70% down, which saves 70% of the gas, of the makeup heat and stuff like that. It saves most of the energy because of fan curves and stuff like that. But you have to really get in the weeds to find this stuff. And so if you're just selling reports, you're never going to do that. When I finally looked at the other report, that 20-year payback one, it was you need new LED lights and new chillers. Well, you don't even have to go to the winery to find that, right?
You need the same technology, but the latest version of it that's slightly more efficient rather than a complete rethink of it. What this is making me want to ask you, Bruce, is you've mentioned how much you admire Unilever and everyone you've met there. From what you're saying, I'm sure it's still very challenging, but still the solutions sound ultimately simple. They just need to be implemented and you need the will to implement them. So I'd love for you to talk about that. Do you think that our main challenges in achieving net zero and decarbonisation are a leadership challenge, really?
Definitely. And an inertia problem. So we're not used to this type of thing either. And so like Unilever is refreshing because of that commitment. That commitment can override other things. Not that you're going to get rid of safety, but you're going to consider how do we still stay safe while we do this? The reason why everybody in the factory facility is committed to that is because you've got this strong, we're not just saying it, we're going to do it, right? And we're going to get here by 2027. So then it's on the factory, how we're going to get there by 2027. And so that really helps a lot. What we say is like our work that we'll talk about in, say, South Sudan, it's a different culture, right? So compared to UK or Canadian culture, it's almost the exact opposite. The way we view leadership, time, authority structures, whatnot. But if I want to get anything done there, I have to navigate that culture. When I do these facilities here, so every Unilever factory I'm in actually has a different culture. Every one of those 35 Maple Leafs has a different culture. If I want to get something implemented, I have to understand that culture and navigate it. So our tagline is actually engineering change, and engineering is the easy part. Just before Christmas, I walked through 3 French fry factories in Oregon. And I know right now what to do, but it won't get done. The rest of the job is to go back, measure it, to make the business case, figure out what the issues are, what's maintenance concern going to be, what's quality is concerned, what's management, bringing that consensus that we can change this and we can change it in this way is the rest of the project, which is overlooked in most procurement processes. Most procurement is, let's just buy this big expensive thing. We'll use our wiles to make it slightly better than terrible so that we can get it done. And meanwhile, we'll overlook these absolutely, fabulous things because say these 20 things, with 1 week payback, 1 month payback, now we got to get 20 times 3 quotes each. That's 60 quotes instead of 1 quote for this big monster project. And so it's much easier to do these single one-off expensive projects than to do these efficiency things that are much more impact. And so I guess we come across kind of the conventional structures that, you have to navigate also. How do we get them out of their own way of how do we procure this thing? Another way we do it is this year we started what we call a fraction engineer. So at our different customers, we just did a big dairy co-op here. So we did 6 factories for them last summer. And now we have 1 engineer every Friday for a year, helping them implement. And really, you're just selling the will to get it done. Because there's so many things going on, making milk and this and that and the other, right? But does somebody keep their eye on the ball? Okay, what's the next step in this? Somebody's got to apply for this approval. Somebody's got to talk to the mechanical contractor. Somebody's got to make this, whatever needs to be done to move that along and then to measure it and to make sure it stays and all that kind of stuff. So selling that just to get things done and implemented is, we're experimenting with different ways. So one way we do that is that fractional engineer. Another way is just, hey, when you hire us for the assessment, throw in $20,000 of implementation. When we get to the 20,000, we'll stop. Or you say, keep going. But that way we don't even have to finish the report before we start implementing. If we all agree this can be done, let's just do it. And so that's the other gap is there's this real hurdle between finding the things and getting them implemented. You find the things, okay, now let's go back through procurement. And a year later, we might implement that thing that had a 1 week payback because we might save $300 on this project that's going to save us $10,000 a day or whatever it is. And so we don't really understand kind of this lost opportunity value would be the other.
I'm seeing a link here to what you said right at the top of our interview as well. And you having that sense of empathy because you have been an outsider in your earlier life. I'm sure it felt like an outsider in your adult life as well, somewhat. That sounds like it's quite key to getting this work done. So being able to go and talk to these people at all levels of an organization and really see it from their point of view. I feel like you probably have some good tips for people who are trying to implement innovative solutions, whatever it might be, whether related to sustainability or not. What would be your top tips to getting people on board?
One aspect would be, say like maintenance staff would be key, but anything we're going to do is going to add to their workload.
And no one wants
Here's
that.
Here's one other thing you got to maintain.
No one
now,
wants that.
Right?
Yeah.
There may be some ways that we can do it that actually makes their job a bit easier. When we do this, let's do this so you can actually maintain it. It's got access space around it and all that kind of stuff. And if we do this, it's going to avoid some other problem for you, that kind of stuff. But also get them to the point of, yes, it's a bit more, it's another thing for your thing, but it actually protects every job in this factory. So if we can improve the margin of, making soup in this factory, it protects those jobs from moving to somewhere else because you reduce the cost per case produced. And so, yes, it's a little bit more, but if you don't do it, you're risking 1,000 jobs, your colleagues, right? And so that's one aspect. The prime one would be quantifying. So we did a cheese factory in Quebec and they're making industrial mozzarella. These big blocks of cheese go down a conveyor and the next conveyor was 6 or 8 inches lower than that one. So it would fall down and a little piece of cheese would fall off. It would land on a tray and they'd make American processed cheese out of it, right? What's the problem? So everybody in the factory can see this, but nobody knows the opportunity. So I took a block of cheese off the thing, put it on the scale, put it back on, let it fall, weighed that block of cheese again. I think it was a gram, could have been 2 grams. I forget what it was, but whatever it was, multiply that by how many of these in a year, how much do you get for processed versus mozzarella? Okay, it's actually $70,000 a year of lost opportunity. Now for $70,000, can we get the conveyor guy in here?
Just from a small drop, and a couple of grams of cheese falling off each block. Yeah.
Each piece. Yeah. And so getting to the dollars, everything seems like a bad idea until you know the value, right? And so the first step is actually measuring it, whether it's food, water, energy. Then, hey, this isn't worth our time. It's a $1,000 problem. Or, hey, this is a $500,000 problem, right? And so getting that quantification is a missing step in a lot of it. And a lot of plants, a lot of people have good ideas already. They just don't know what it's going to save. So let's just measure it. And we just say, hey, here's Todd's idea. It's going to save you $40,000 of grape juice a year. He gets some visibility within his organization. This project actually gets done instead of sitting there for 10 years. And so this quantification step is missing most of the time.
So you gave a TEDx talk, which I'll put in the podcast newsletter for people to have a watch because it's a great watch. You're talking about Africa and charity. And there's one line that I love, and I'd love you to expand on it, which is that the problem with Africa is in our heads. What did you mean by that? And can you tell us a bit more about that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. The reason I invested the time in developing the TED Talk, which is a lot of work, but it's very worthwhile, teaching you how to kind of refine your ideas and present them, but was because half the problem isn't in Africa. It's here. And the way we think about helping actually creates damage. And if you have time to watch that TED Talk, it kind of gives a real life example of a mosquito net company in Tanzania. So the last day I was doing some water training at our projects in Uganda. And the last day of the course, I lost my entire class because they were called away to do the mosquito net delivery, which is fine. But when you look into it, where did those mosquito nets come from? In that case, they were likely containers shipped in from China because that's the least expensive way for the charity to get them and distribute them door to door versus the company in Tanzania that makes mosquito nets. Now, the company in Tanzania laid off 600 employees because how do you compete with free mosquito nets delivered to your customer's door? Right? And so what are the impacts on those 600 families? And so the way we think about aid is a really challenge. And so that's one aspect. Another aspect is different companies say, hey, we'd like to do volunteer opportunity with our employees. Say, that's great. But I don't want them to build water filters because our teams in Uganda can build water filters better than you or I can. Instead of you building a mediocre one or, building a shed when the local tradesman watches you build it for free, is what skills do you have? I'm in sales. That's great. Let's teach them that. I'm in bookkeeping. Let's teach, accountability and, these kinds of things. So the gifts that you already have, how to use those instead of trying to use our mediocre skills to replace somebody who it's their livelihood to do that. And so we've just got this misapprehension of how to help. And it's not the intention. The intention is perfectly fine and good, right? It's the outcome. And an illustration that I use is just, say fish. If I hand out 1,000 fish, it looks like a very good use of your money, right? But what you don't see is a local fishmonger going out of business because I'm giving away free fish. But if I were to instead teach 10 people how to fish, then you'd say, why am I paying for your fishing trip? So it looks worse to do it the right way. And so basically we need a different quality of donors who are interested in the long term instead of the immediate, say, drilling wells. Here's the first water coming out of the well. Well, when we test the wells, 78% of them in Kajukeji County, it's either 72 or 78, had E. coli coming out of the wells, right? And the other water sources. So we tested every water source they had in that county. And so instead, it's not actually a supply issue, it's a treatment issue. And so we teach them how to build these water purifiers with the local materials, how to run a business, how to sell the filters so they can be self-supporting. And then the opportunity for us to get involved is for families who earn under $2 a day, how about a price discount? So you're not buying the whole thing, but you're helping them buy it. So what you're doing is you're making your intervention where it can make the most good, but it's capacity building is the main benefit. And another film you might want to put in the link is called Nanga Kinda, which means resiliency. And it's the true story of the South Sudanese refugees. So our water projects in South Sudan are all closed right now because of the civil war. Our managers are literally refugees in Uganda. And instead of sitting in the refugee camps, they restarted the projects from the refugee camps. And they're providing safe water to the Ugandan communities, hosting the refugees who've never had safe water themselves. And so rather than being a burden, these refugees are actually an asset to these communities, right? And they're up and running, covering their own costs in a new country. The difference is because of the training. Every tool we bought is still in South Sudan, but all the training is still in their heads. And so basically training is really the main benefit when we're doing international development work versus me going and actually doing the engineering. I'm much better to go teach somebody how to do it, right, when I'm there.
Absolutely. That's a phrase that I remember being on adverts here in the UK for certain charities that, give a man a fish, he'll feed himself for a day. Teach a man to fish, he can feed himself for a lifetime. We've known this for a long time, right? I think it's very profound what you said around doing it the right way looks worse than doing it the wrong way. Like, that's bad, isn't it? And that kind of feels to me like what we were talking about earlier, which is like this is a kind of a leadership problem in a way. We don't see that. We've kind of been led down this path.
Let me expand on that too. So to illustrate that, you can teach a person to fish, but what if you taught them how to teach other people how to fish? So during COVID, during the civil war, the managers are in Uganda instead of South Sudan because of the war. We didn't go, and they taught the local people how to build the filters, right? They taught the local people how to sell the filters. And even this month, there's a new town called Jinja, Uganda that wants a project. An entrepreneur and 2 technicians from there are working for the existing projects in Pakwach, Uganda, again, without us going. And they're learning from them how to do it. And in February, they'll go back and start their own project in Jinja. And so train the trainers, I guess, would be the aspect that you're trying to get across.
I love that. And that is real resilience. That's real development. And was it you that was telling me a story from your water project where there was a family that was getting a water filter and the man of the house was too ashamed to accept it or something? Was that right?
Yeah. So that's another aspect of this that we don't typically think about is the dignity angle. If you're distributing free miskin, that's water, whatnot, you see this immediate need and that it's a valid need, right? The most efficient way to do it is let's just give these out. But what you don't realize is you're changing the purchases with somebody's dignity. So when we go to inspect water filters, if I go to a home and the wife is showing me how this water filter works and the husband is off in the corner of the garden and doesn't come over, probably that filter was bought and given to them and it was purchased with his dignity. If I go to the home and the wife's showing me how to do it, the husband barges in, pushes her aside and tells me how the thing works. He's proud of it. He's bought it for his family. He's providing for his family. And that family is much, much more likely to continue using it. And so there's an aspect of dignity. What we encourage is when we go work, we're actually a servant of the local project. We're not even the equal. It's how do we help the local teams there succeed? It's a different type of mentality versus kind of a sad commentary is one of the videos from a local team member. One of our team members was asking them, to define the difference between conventional charity and development. And his terminology was, you're no longer a slave to the donor. And so it's kind of jarring for us. But when you think about it, in a conventional charitable model, basically, if you're going to eat, it's because this charity keeps sending you money. If they stop, then you're done, right? And they make all the decisions. So in our project, we don't make any decisions. We change it into a business transaction where we buy these discounts every month, right? And if you give me an invoice and you give me the GPS coordinates and the photos that these were installed and they're working and whatnot, then I pay that discount. And then you use that to pay your staff to do whatever you're going to do with that kind of thing. So you make your decisions on the project versus us.
I find this absolutely fascinating and exactly the kind of reason that we founded this podcast, really, which was just to think about things in a little bit of a different way, a little bit of a radical way. Bruce, should we stop giving to charity based on this reality?
Yeah. So interestingly, the only people that conventional charity is actually accountable to is actually the donor. So part of the problem is they're not actually accountable to the recipients. They're objects of these deliveries. And that's a bit crude and crass to say it that way or whatever, but basically it's the donor that actually conventional charities are most accountable to. World Vision did a study and more than half the wells in Africa didn't work after 1 year. Why? Do you know how to fix a well, Rob?
No, I don't know.
No, why would they know how, right? Do you have any spare parts? No, right?
Yeah. I might have gone as an 18-year-old to go and help install one, but I don't know how to maintain it. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the challenge is for us donors, hey, I want to pay for the well driller. I don't want to pay for any overhead. I want all of it to go right there. Well, all you're doing is drilling a hole in the ground then. Because if you don't put in the infrastructure around it, it's going to break, as every well breaks within a year because they all have moving parts, right? And so if you don't spend the extra time of, the committee that's going to maintain this and how they're going to raise the money to buy the spare parts when they do break and whatnot, then you're basically just putting expensive holes in the ground. This kind of bias against admin, right, hamstrings conventional charities. How much goes to overhead? The conventional charities are hamstrung because they're trying to make it as little as possible, which means that you're not putting in the long-term solutions. So if a donor starts asking, hey, how about 5 years from now? How's this thing going to be maintained, right? If the donors start asking, to buy what they actually want to buy, that's kind of another angle that I take is, what do you actually want to buy? Do you actually want a week's worth of water and one kid drinking unsafe water coming out of a well? Or do you want a long-term safe water supply? Probably you're donating towards the long-term safe. You just don't know that you're not getting it because you get the initial picture and no follow-up. But if you start asking for that follow-up, then the same thing. And so it's the same thing with purchasing in our work here. What do you actually want to buy? When you're buying an energy audit, do you actually want to buy a stack of papers that are useless? Or do you actually want to buy something that's going to save you a lot of money and change your factory, right? When you're building something, and you're trying for the lowest initial price to build it, what you're doing is you're maximizing the overall cost automatically because the lowest initial price is automatically the most expensive to operate because you're buying the flimsiest, least efficient equipment that you're going to break and that's going to use more energy for its entire life. So again, we say, what do you actually want to buy? Are you going to run this thing afterwards? Then you actually want to buy the lowest life cycle cost, not the lowest initial cost. And we'll help them do the economic analysis. Hey, you could buy this one. If you buy that one instead, there's a 2-year payback to throw that initial one away immediately. Or just buy this one for, an extra 1 month or whatever it is. And you're going to save 30 air conditioning or whatever it is. Just to make that business case for what's in your best interest in the long term. Sustainability is really a long-term vision. And this is why sustainable companies outcompete, particularly private companies that are interested in the next quarter, because they'll kill their own company for the next quarter to meet this quarter. Not even their competitors. They'll vandalize their own company, right? And so versus, okay, I'm going to invest in this. I'm going to save in the next 5 years every year. And so this longer horizon gives these companies,
huge discounts. I'm imagining in sales.
Yeah. Go ahead.
We need to make this quarter, so we deep discount, we overpromise on the product, on the implementation, but we get the deal signed, we meet the quarter, and then everyone has a terrible experience. No one recommends us. None of those sales that would have come in at a more appropriate time in the next quarter do. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly. One of our best engineers or our best technicians, he was working for a multinational company. He got sick of that. They'd have a fire sale at the end of every quarter and sell the stuff. And now the next quarter you're trying to sell and your customers all have a warehouse full of discounted product. That had nothing to do with their competitor. That was their own company that was putting them on that treadmill. And so, thinking about the long term is really much better economic. That's why, when you look at the B corporations, they outcompete their peers. And basically, if I'm going to compete, I need to have a different business model than my peers, because my peers have maximized one aspect. How do you beat it out of your whole supply chain to get this or whatever? Whereas I'm trying to create triple bottom line, social, economic, environmental at the same time. So if I compete on the same business model, I will lose. So I have to develop a new business model. If a company is alive, then they're doing something different. And if you want to find innovation, that's where you can find it, right? A great example I like is Greyston Bakery. So they're in Yonkers, New York. They make the brownies for Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Their hiring policy is, if you go in the lobby and you write your name down, they will hire you. No interview, no background check, no nothing. And they have the most loyal, diligent employees you can imagine. And, phenomenal stories. Hey, I just got out of prison. Nobody would give me a shot. These guys gave me a shot. Then I was a supervisor. Then I was a whatever. And so these different paradigms really come out of this framework, because you need a different paradigm if you're going to survive.
I love this. I love the story you've just told. Reminds me of a company called Timpson here in the UK. We interviewed Janet from Timpson on an earlier episode, which has been one of our most popular. So they have a similar ethos where all they need for you to apply is your name and phone number, and then they will interview you for an open position. And they do a lot of work with ex-offenders and getting them into employment, and do a fantastic job there. I love what you said about considering the life cycle price as opposed to the sales price. I think there's something in there for everything that we buy as individual consumers and as businesses. I think that's a fantastic kind of mindset shift. Well, we must move on, Bruce. So we're going to move on to a little bit radical world now, Bruce, and your work is very closely entwined with some global issues, both kind of energy usage, sustainability, international development. But what's one kind of change for the world that you would like people to get behind?
I think one barrier we frequently come across is kind of a local bias. So there's nothing wrong with investing locally, but not to the detriment of not also investing globally. So in the context of carbon, the developed world created the problem, right? Our emissions are much, 10 times higher or more per capita than the developing countries. However, the developing countries experience it disproportionately because they don't have irrigation. They don't have, these other things to help mitigate the impacts of this climate change. And then when we come to investing, we then choose to invest in ourselves again. So there's a little bit more money to go around. Let's spend it on ourselves. Let's take this landfill and burn the methane that's coming off it and maybe make energy or put it in the pipeline, which we should have been doing anyways. And we'll milk that for the next 20 years. Versus, why don't we help people, in our model, hey, you're in poverty, you're drinking unsafe water. That's great. You're not using much carbon. You just stay that way. Versus, okay, that's actually not acceptable. You have to, as a minimum, have safe water, right? And so rather than boiling the water, which would add to emissions, why don't we provide safe water this way that has no additional emissions? Basically, these water filters we build, they last 25 years. They need no energy or chemicals to operate. There's a tiny bit to make a third of a bag of cement in the first place, kind of thing, to make this filter out of, so that you're not locked into this poverty forever. Anytime anybody in your family takes a drink of water, you can get a bill, for, in their case, $50 for a typhoid needle, and you make $1 a day. This is a big hit, right? And so you're never going to get out of poverty if you can get stuck with a bill like that at any time. How do you make our investments where they make the most good? So in addition, say like the landfill, not to pick on that or whatever, but you got one benefit, right? Climate. For the same investment, you could have climate, poverty, health, education, equity, life on land, right? All kinds of other SDG co-benefits from the same investment, right? Because your investment can go much further there. Similarly, I don't have solar panels on my roof of our head office. Why? I put them on the roof of the orphanage in South Sudan instead. They have twice as much daylight as Canada because they don't have winter. And so every single panel produces twice as much electricity. Our grid in Ontario is 10% fossil fuel. Theirs is 100%. It was a generator. They shut off their generator. They don't need it anymore. they now don't need to buy fuel for that generator. They can buy food with that instead. So you get a social benefit.
So, Bruce, our last question is always the same, which is that if there's someone listening to this podcast who has a little bit of a radical idea for a business or for their own life, but they don't know where to get started, what advice would you give that person?
I think the idea itself is very valuable. So I didn't set out to be an entrepreneur because I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I set out to be an entrepreneur because what I wanted didn't exist in the world. And I probably wouldn't be doing as well if I was doing something else. So the passion I have for what we're doing really overrides a lot. And then I would say, as you're growing your organization, as you start out, you can probably do most jobs, it's quicker to do it yourself than to have somebody else train somebody else. But if you train somebody else, then eventually your time is freed up. And so invest a lot in training in your own organization and the organizations you work with so that you're building capacity, basically, would be the thing. So if you've got an idea, that's great. The world needs it. And think it through, discuss it with a lot of people, make sure it's a robust idea. One aspect is you could just look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And that's what we do for Enviro Stewards and we do for the water projects. And how does it positively or negatively, directly or indirectly affect each of those? So you're doing the same thing, but you're doing it in a way that benefits each of the others. Or you can do it in a way that is a detriment to each of the others. And so you have to think it through first. And then you need to consider the economic engine in addition to the social. So if you're trying to do something, you're probably thinking very strongly about the environmental or social thing, but it also needs to be economically viable or it's not going to sustain itself. How do you work through that model, right? And so in our case, we found a model that, discerning folks are willing to go for, right? Because it's actually suiting their deep felt needs, right? And we're using that to subsidize the other work that we're doing. And then there's all kinds of co-benefits that come out of that, just from this long range view, keeping your staff long range. I don't have to retrain people and attract people and whatnot. There's often a waiting list to join our company kind of thing. And so there's all kinds of these other benefits once you embark on this journey. So I'd encourage you to start, and you're going to make mistakes. When I first went to South Sudan, I would have, if I had money, done a conventional charity there, but I didn't have money. So I had to come up with something else. So the constraints themselves also help you. And just start doing something. Don't wait till it's perfect. Just as soon as you know it needs to be different, just adjust your rudder a little bit and go a different direction. So just get started.
Bruce, we've reached the end of our interview, sadly. I found it absolutely fascinating. So good luck for the future, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.